So imagine a movie that begins just like this. A man and a woman, strangers, bump into each other. Maybe it's in an office and she's new working there, or maybe it's a hotel lobby and he's on vacation. It doesn't matter. The two characters bump into each other, and one of them drops everything they're carrying, coffee or a stack of papers, bag full of odd trinkets. They both squat down to pick it up, and for a moment, they look up, and eyes meet. Whatever happens after that, we know, we've been conditioned to know that this is the moment where lovers meet. We may not have ever seen this movie before, but the trope puts us on alert. Pay attention to these two characters. This is the love interest. The film may end up playing on our expectations and attempt to upend the trope a little to take us somewhere surprising, but the expectation has been set. The first hearers of this gospel story would have experienced something similar in the setup, this encounter of Jesus and the woman at the well. In the biblical world, when a man and a woman meet at a well, it is bound to be a love story. Abraham sent his servant to seek a wife for his son Isaac. And at the well, a woman named Rebekah came to draw water, and Rebekah would end up becoming Isaac's wife. Moses sat down by a well, and a woman named Zipporah came to draw water, and Zipporah would become Moses' wife. So in the heat of the day, when Jesus sits down by a well to rest, the imagination of those hearing the story is primed. And then a woman shows up. A Samaritan woman, which is a bit troubling actually, because Samaritans and Jews have a centuries-old violent conflict, and yet we know this is going to be a love story, a story about relationship. The story may, in the end, play on our expectations, upend the trope a little to take us somewhere surprising, somewhere deeper, but the expectation has been set. So then if we skip to the end of the story for a moment, it's interesting, isn't it, how the woman described her encounter with Jesus? Because a lot of things happened in that conversation that I just read at the well. A lot of conversation was shared. It's actually the longest one-on-one conversation Jesus has with anyone in all of the Gospels. So when the woman went to tell people about this meeting, she could have said, "Come and see the Jew who talked theology with a Samaritan." Or she could have said, "Come and see the man who talked theology with a woman." Or even, "Come and see the one who pretty sure called himself the Messiah." But while this is a story rich with layers about theology, about who God is, about worship, where God can be found, about breaking down ethnic and cultural barriers, this is, in the beginning and in the end, a well story, a story about love. And that's what stuck with the woman, it seems. That's what she wanted to tell people later on about the relationship that had been formed, about the understanding, acceptance that she felt. Come and see the one who told me everything I have ever done. Probably he was not the first to have some comments on everything she had ever done. She was coming to the well at noon in the heat of the day, suggesting she may have been trying to avoid the morning rush and the evening rush, trying to avoid having to talk to anyone. The villagers may have had plenty to gossip about regarding this woman who had had 5 husbands and now had none. Popular interpretation since then has certainly had plenty to say about this woman. She has often been painted as a harlot, a serial divorcee, a woman who by some fault just can't hold on to a marriage. But none of that is actually in the text. And Jesus doesn't say she's a sinner, doesn't say she's in need of forgiveness, doesn't say she's done anything wrong. At the time, women had very little, if any, power to initiate divorce. So if she was many times divorced, it wasn't by choice. more likely than a promiscuous girl or one who had flunked multiple marriages, she had some kind of painful past. The kind that people told stories about. You know, Deborah, the disabled one? Seems like the men just keep ditching her when they realize she can't keep house too well. Hey, have you heard about Deborah? She's the one whose husbands keep dying. Maybe she's cursed. Or, hey, have you heard about Deborah? I heard Matthias divorced her because she couldn't bear a child. That's after what, 4 or 5 men now? Failed to have a baby? Maybe she's cursed. Stories about her past, about what she'd done, what she hadn't done, had likely been told over and over in the village. But this time was different. Jesus told her everything she'd ever done. He saw it all. He knew the whole story. The pain, maybe a misstep, a shame, and he named it right smack in the middle of a conversation about theology and water. After all, what did the question or comment, "Go call your husband," have to do with their conversation? I like to think he asked it to reveal to her that he knew, that he saw her and it was okay. He named her reality without shame or judgment attached. He named it because sometimes it is freeing to let the truth come out into the open. He named it because at the well, relationships are formed, and love requires the truth of the whole story. Getting that story, that everything she'd ever done, out into the open, catapulted the conversation into a much deeper level. Instead of literal water and superficial religious differences, they were now speaking about the things a soul longs for. True, lasting relationship, a spirit-filled experience of God, one that goes beyond the rituals of mountains and temples and makes one aware of God's presence, truly. The hope of a Messiah who will bring reconciliation and justice, will bring an end to division and shame, living water, some kind of soul-quenching hope that cuts through the thirst of our everydays and bubbles up into eternal life. After speaking of these things, the woman left her water jar behind, and she went and shared what stuck most with her from that meeting with Jesus. It seems to me she had a kind of joy and energy as she ran to tell the others, "Come and see a man who told me everything I have ever done." I think that the emphasis on relationship and on the sense of being seen and known is so important to us today. Because even now, 2,000 years later, even after all the progress of history, after the improvements in the rights of women and who can talk to who, and the destigmatization of so many things beyond our control, we are really, many of us, not so far removed from this woman's burdens and her longings. I don't want to overstate our connection with the woman. Most of us are not marginalized ethnic minorities in our nation, though perhaps some are. Most are probably not reviled for painful histories that others gossip about, though perhaps some are. Our differences from the woman might be an invitation to recognize that often those who bear the weight of shame and tragedy and marginalization can turn out to be model disciples, powerful storytellers of God's love. And yet, on another level, so many of us carry the kinds of shame that she did, imposed by self or society, and the kinds of longings she did, longing to be seen and yet loved still, to encounter God's presence right here and now in our daily routines and not just in some mountaintop experience. In 2023, right now in our society, shame and hopelessness are being internalized by Americans, and especially young Americans, in an untenable way. We are in a mental health crisis that demands a response. Many of you likely saw headlines in February after the CDC released its biennial youth risk behavior survey. The most recent survey data, which was from 2021, revealed major increases in teens reporting depression, self-harm, sexual violence. The levels were particularly elevated among girls and LGBTQ teens. Among high school students, 57% of girls and 69% of LGBTQ teens reported persistent sadness and hopelessness, a key marker for depression. Now, I'm not a psychologist or a sociologist, and I couldn't begin to try and untangle the causes. Mental health is a challenge among children and adults, too. There's something in the air, I guess. Something in the air, whether social media or divisiveness or pressures of time and status and money, and the pandemic certainly did not help with any of this. There's something in the air that invites many of us to self-isolate and then internalize shame. And while the headlines have been about this data have been that the girls are not okay, it's not restricted to girls by any means. While rates of reported mental health challenges are highest among girls and members of the LGBTQ community, there may perhaps be more stigma attached for boys and men seeking support for their mental health concerns. But one teen girl interviewed in response to this CDC survey shared that over the past couple years, she had been trying to hold it all together, but secretly dealing with severe depression. Even her mom, whom she described as her best friend, had no idea what she was going through. She had long inhabited the role of a happy, high achiever, and she didn't know how to let her pain be seen. The good news is that now she is receiving both clinical and social support, and she's even started a mental health club in her high school to support peers with their struggles. But when the story our community tells us about us is high achiever, it can be hard to break through that noise and be seen in all our beautiful and sometimes painful complexity. Or perhaps more like the woman, when the story that we sense being told of us is more like, pity this person and steer clear of them. We already feel too vulnerable and often have no interest in sharing more of our story or our longing. If people knew everything we had ever done, everything we'd ever contemplated, everything we'd ever questioned, everything we've ever wished for, would they laugh at us? Would they want to keep talking to us at all? And so yes, the mental health crisis in our nation calls for more therapists and medical screening and support groups and guidance counselors. I'm glad that a couple years ago, an interfaith community organizing group around here successfully asked Fairfax County schools to increase the funding for guidance counselors in schools. There's more work to do there. But also the internalized shame that so many carry calls for a simple encounter of love. A well where we can sit down and rest when we are tired, when we are thirsty, when we are longing. I can still remember, as though it is happening right now, everything about that moment as a teenager when I felt an encounter of love with Jesus. I was a teenager who was always longing for someone to understand, but always a little off from my peers, wearing 3 seasons ago hand-me-downs and getting the internet 5 years later than everyone else and saying croissant instead of croissant like everybody else, and always being a little too into my grades and Jesus. It was middling stuff. But even that was enough to give me a little sense of inadequacy and even shame at times. And I remember just that everyday moment, the warm light of the lamp, the music of grace playing in the background, and this sense that God saw and knew and understood and loved me. And I'm honestly here today because I still believe those encounters with Jesus are possible, and that each of us can get beneath the voices of our shame and inadequacy and know a God who knows everything we are in everything we've done and finds us not just adequate, but lovely. And I'm also here today because I still believe that the disciples of Jesus can be better than they are in this story. In this story, they see Jesus talking with this woman and raise their eyebrows, exchange glances, but politely remain silent in the background, in their judgment. But I dream of a church where no one, regardless of gender or dress or age or whatever, feels like there are a bunch of disciples eyeing them suspiciously. Rather, in my dream, the church and its people welcome them in because we ourselves have experienced enough of Jesus to know that there's plenty of love to go around. The church and its people listen, really listen, and notice the quiet one-phrase answers people give to questions about their job or their family or their kids. I have no husband. And recognize that there's so much more behind that answer longing to be seen. The church and its people give everyone a well to come drink from, a well that's more than rituals and moral checklists, that's full of soul-quenching living water. In my dream, the church gives all of us a space to encounter a Jesus who says gently, I know everything you have ever done, and I love you. After all, what else could we expect to hear? We are resting at a well, and this is a love story. Thanks be to God.